reputable bank, an ordinary customer faces blatant discrimination from the staff. But when her true identity is revealed, everything suddenly changes. A battle between power and justice begins, where skeptical eyes must confront an undeniable truth. In the dim, ethereal glow of towering skyscrapers, a woman stood quietly in the hallway of Meridian Financial Bank, a place she once navigated as a rookie employee and now commanded as an undeniable executive powerhouse. Angela Freeman was a woman with a long and challenging career in finance. Someone who, at first glance, you'd never guess was the head of one of the nation's largest financial institutions. Today, Angela wore a simple outfit, a stark contrast to the expensive suits she typically donned for high-stakes meetings. She opted for a navy hoodie, dark pants, and a discreet baseball cap to ensure no one recognized her. The subtle makeup on her face didn't mask her confidence, but rather complemented it, lending her an approachable air. She stepped into the bank, her gaze fixed ahead, her strides unhurried, as if she were strolling through a park, not entering one of the country's most prestigious bank branches. But everything had changed. Angela was no longer the novice bank employee standing behind the counter, fumbling with numbers. She was no longer the one striving day after day to prove herself under skeptical gazes. She was, now, Angela Freeman, CEO of Meridian Financial, the first woman in the company's history to reach that position, a figure capable of reshaping an entire system with ease. Yet today, she wasn't here to work. She was here to witness something she knew all too well, something both she and the organization had ignored for far too long. Meridian Financial Bank prided itself on its achievements, profits, expansion, and business strategies that looked flawless on paper. But as Angela had come to realize, numbers didn't tell the whole story. Behind the rankings, the glamorous meetings, and the innovative sales tactics lay another narrative, one no one wanted to acknowledge. With her experience and keen analytical mind, Angela had spotted something alarming in the data from this branch. As she entered the bank's lobby, no one recognized her. Though she was the most powerful woman in the company, today she was just an ordinary customer, someone any bank employee might dismiss without a second thought. She sat in the waiting area, pulled out her phone, and pretended to check emails, but her eyes never strayed from the activity around her. Almost immediately, she noticed a difference in how the staff treated customers. A white man in an expensive suit walked in and, before even reaching the counter, was greeted by an employee who escorted him to a private desk. There were no questions, no doubts, just seamless service. Meanwhile, an Asian American couple was directed to take a number as if they were merely part of a process, nothing more. Even a young white woman in casual clothes was served instantly, without the slightest delay. Then there was a Hispanic man in work clothes. He approached to withdraw money but was asked for extra documentation, scrutinized so thoroughly that every paper he handed over was met with visible suspicion. A wave of emotion surged within Angela. She knew this wasn't random. It was systemic discrimination. It wasn't the first time she'd noticed this injustice. The reports she'd reviewed, the customer complaints brushed aside, all pointed to an unfairness in how the bank served its clients. But today, Angela decided she could no longer turn a blind eye. Why did she have to wait so long while others were served immediately? Why did she have to endure such dismissive treatment despite being a legitimate customer who'd been loyal to this bank for years? Angela gripped her bag tightly, biting her lip to stay calm. She knew she couldn't let her anger show. Not yet. This was a lesson for everyone who'd face her in the future. Angela wasn't here for a routine inspection. She wasn't here to challenge individual employees. She was here for something bigger. She was here to truly understand what was happening in this bank, to confront an issue no one dared admit, and to find a real solution, not just for herself but for all the customers overlooked in the shadow of discrimination. She stood up, resolute, and walked toward the counter. Every eye in the bank turned to her, but Angela didn't falter. Today, she wasn't just here to withdraw money. She was here to start changing an entire system. Angela Freeman sat silently, her eyes fixed on her phone screen, but her heart pounded harder than ever. She could feel the tension rising in the air around her. The chatter from the transaction counters, the hurried footsteps of bank employees, all of it sounded like the relentless pulse of a smoothly operating machine. Yet amid the noise, Angela felt like an outsider. She knew she wasn't like them. It wasn't just her attire, it was her skin color, something those around her seemed to have grown accustomed to but never truly accepted. She had been here before, in a bank uniform, moving slowly behind the counter, observing and learning. But now, sitting here as a customer, she was met with suspicious glances. Despite being the head of this very organization, Angela couldn't ignore the palpable shift in the atmosphere, a shift she recognized the moment she walked in. As she passed through the frosted glass doors of the bank, she caught the first look, cold and unfriendly, from an employee at the counter. The man, stern-faced and devoid of emotion, greeted her with a curt nod, as if she were just another ordinary customer. Moments later, a white man in an expensive suit stepped in and was immediately approached by another employee. A simple question was asked. "How can we assist you, sir?" And he was ushered into a private room to conduct his business. No hesitation, no scrutiny, just effortless service, like a breeze passing through. Angela knew this wasn't a coincidence. She recognized it instantly, the discrimination she'd heard about so often from her customers. Complaints had been documented, but this was the first time she'd witnessed it firsthand, not just in the behavior but in the blatant disrespect. When an Asian couple entered, there was no warm greeting or welcoming gesture. They were directed to an empty chair in the corner and told to wait. There was no empathy in the employee's eyes, just a cold, impatient wave of the hand. It was as if they were mere numbers in the system this bank operated. Then came a young white woman, casually dressed, who didn't have to wait long. As expected, a bank employee greeted her warmly, asked about her weekend, and completed her transaction in under 2 minutes. It all happened so quickly, so smoothly. Angela watched the scene with an odd sensation. Something was wrong. She'd been in this position before, but now she could only observe and feel the discrimination she'd endured for so long. Not always visible, but unmistakable today. Everything was clearer than ever. And then there was the Hispanic man in work clothes. He approached the counter, holding a small check, his expression plain, but he immediately drew more attention than anyone else. Angela could hear the unnecessary questions, see the skeptical looks from the bank staff, as they demanded more documentation than required. He couldn't escape their scrutiny. An unexpected demand arose. "Can you prove this money is legitimate?" Those questions, those looks, they were all too familiar to Angela. She couldn't sit still any longer. Angela stood, gripping her bag tightly, and walked slowly toward the counter. She felt every eye in the bank turn toward her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't accept this discrimination, couldn't allow her customers to endure such unjust treatment any longer. Each step she took was a signal, a resolve to change everything. As she neared the counter, the employee there looked at her with a face devoid of surprise or respect in their greeting. Angela wasn't shocked by the lack of courtesy. She'd faced such attitudes before, but this time, she knew she couldn't let the discrimination persist. She smiled, but it wasn't a gentle smile. It was the smile of determination, of a strong woman standing up against injustice. "Hello," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'd like to complete my withdrawal transaction." Her words were a declaration, a warning to everyone watching. What they hadn't yet realized, she saw clearly. Angela Freeman wouldn't let anyone be treated unfairly in this bank. Not as a customer, not when she had to confront anyone, and that, she knew, would soon change. Angela Freeman couldn't quite grasp the feeling swelling inside her. It was unfolding like a silent storm, slow but uncontrollable. At first, it was just a mild irritation, an odd glance from a bank employee, then the awkwardness of waiting longer than every other customer. But as the delay stretched on, as those scrutinizing looks became more overt, she began to sense something that, despite her powerful role as an executive, she had never confronted so directly before. Unmasked discrimination. She sat down, mentally calculating, maintaining the composure expected of a leader. But the longer she waited, the more the suffocating feeling spread through the space. The customers around her seemed oblivious to her presence. The bank employees carried on with their tasks, calm and indifferent, as if she were nothing in their world. She started to realize that the silence hurt more than any words ever could. Time ticked by, the clock on the bank wall steadily reminding her of the unexplained delay. She had been waiting for nearly half an hour, yet 3 customers who arrived after her were served first. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit was ushered straight to a private room, no questions asked. A young white woman in simple office attire faced no delays either. Her transaction was completed in minutes, and she was on her way. Meanwhile, Angela remained seated in the cold expanse of the bank, where she could feel the discrimination in every glance, every gesture from the staff. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. But as she stood to approach the counter, the situation became even clearer. Another employee, Beth, glanced over from behind the counter, her eyes betraying a mix of confusion and vagueness. Not the warm welcome or friendliness Angela might have expected. Instead, there was hesitation, a flicker of doubt in her gaze. Angela wasn't surprised. She was used to strange looks, unspoken questions that lingered in the air. But this time the tension was undeniable. When Angela placed her withdrawal request on the counter, Beth gave her a quick glance, her eyes lingering on the bank card, then shifting back to Angela, then down to the paper again. A faint smirk betrayed her skepticism. "This is quite a large sum, ma'am," she said, her tone laced with subtle mockery, as if implying Angela couldn't possibly have the funds to withdraw such an amount. "Can you prove this is your account?" A wave of anger surged in Angela's chest. Each of Beth's words cut like a knife. She had been the CEO of this bank for years, making critical decisions and steering major strategies, yet now a bank employee was questioning her right to access her own money, especially when a white man nearby had just completed his transaction in under 2 minutes without a single question. Angela smiled, but there was no warmth in it. She refused to let her emotions take over. "It's my money," she replied, her voice steady but resolute. "I'm simply making a withdrawal. You can check the details in your system." But unlike previous encounters where employees swiftly complied, this time was different. Beth turned to Mark, a more senior staff member, and whispered something. Angela couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She knew they were discussing her, their suspicions plain to see. Within seconds, Mark approached, standing beside Beth, his face etched with irritation. "Is there a problem?" he asked loudly, his voice echoing through the room. Every eye turned to Angela. "Can you do something for me?" she shot back, her patience wearing thin. She was tired of being treated like an unwelcome intruder. This was her account, her money. Mark didn't respond. Instead, he turned away and summoned another employee. "Double-check her account details. We need to verify everything." Each word felt like a slap to Angela's face. She knew their doubts went beyond mere account verification. It was disdain, blatant discrimination. The tension continued to mount as the bank staff gathered, exchanging skeptical glances. Richard, another employee, stepped closer, his face unable to hide a sneer. "Maybe you just came into some unexpected money, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "A big event, or maybe an inheritance." They were toying with her. Angela felt the humiliation in every syllable. She silently counted the beats of her heart, refusing to let it show. She wasn't one to be easily provoked, but today she felt pushed to her limit. The absurd questions, the contemptuous looks, it was all building up inside her. "I'm not leaving," Angela declared, her gaze icy. "I demand to be served like any other customer." And there she stood, unflinching, unafraid, even as those around her began to realize she wasn't someone they could dismiss so easily. Angela Freeman could no longer tolerate it. The feeling of being belittled, dismissed, not because she was unaccustomed to challenges in her career, but because everything she had built, everything she had sacrificed to reach this position was being undermined right before her eyes. She wasn't someone easily shaken, but today her patience had been stretched to its breaking point. The sting of humiliation rose like a wave, but Angela knew she couldn't let herself lose control. She had learned a vital lesson. Throughout her career, success didn't always come from showing emotion. Patience and self-mastery were what carried you through. Yet today, an overwhelming urge surged within her, an indescribable feeling. She had to act. She sat back down, her hands gripping her bag tightly. Despite the blatant injustice unfolding before her, she had to maintain an unshakable image. A woman of power, not just through words, but through her action. That didn't mean she would let the discrimination continue unchecked. As Mark and Richard exchanged skeptical, even mocking glances, Angela knew things had gone too far. These bank employees were treating her like a criminal, and that was unacceptable. She wasn't a customer who needed to prove her worthiness for service. She was the CEO of this bank, someone who had dedicated her life to making this institution a powerhouse. Angela took a deep breath, feeling the chill in the air. She decided to stand. Eyes from every direction immediately fixed on her. Though she didn't see them, she could sense the stares. The atmosphere shifted. Attention was turning toward her, as if everyone knew something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. She walked toward the counter where Beth still stood, her eyes betraying awkwardness but maintaining a cold demeanor. Beth looked at Angela as if she were a nobody, just another passerby in the bank. Angela wouldn't allow herself to stop. She could no longer stay silent. She had kept quiet for too long on her climb to this position, witnessing countless instances of discrimination and unfairness. But this time she wouldn't stay silent. She wouldn't let this go on. She placed her hand on the counter, not an invitation but a declaration of power, of resolve. "I want to speak to someone in charge," Angela said, her voice calm but undeniably firm. Each word carried the weight of her patience and strength. Beth froze for a moment. Then, realizing Angela had no intention of backing down, she turned her head hesitantly. She said nothing, only glancing at Mark, who stood behind her. Mark raised an eyebrow, his expression still dripping with doubt. Angela didn't take her eyes off them. She didn't retreat, not even slightly. That's when she knew this wouldn't end unless she took action. She had fought to earn this power, endured countless skeptical looks and whispered criticisms. Now she couldn't let those looks defeat her. She wouldn't let this bank perpetuate its discriminatory policies and attitudes any longer. She no longer noticed her surroundings. Her focus narrowed to a single goal: to be served, and to make these employees realize they had no right to treat her or anyone this way. "Can you call someone higher up?" Angela asked again, her voice now carrying a sharper edge. She didn't need to explain further or justify herself. She just needed to act, and those in charge would have to recognize the gravity of the situation. Mark looked at her, his expression beginning to shift. He saw the determination in Angela's eyes, the powerful calm she exuded, and it unsettled him. For the first time in this exchange, he sensed he was facing someone not easily overcome, and Angela, without saying everything, had made her message clear. She wouldn't let anyone continue to disrespect her, no matter who they were or where they stood. Finally, Beth could no longer avoid acting. She quietly turned, walked to a corner of the counter, and began calling for someone with higher authority. Angela didn't waver. She stood there, steadfast, like a warrior awaiting the next battle, one where justice would be served. This was only the beginning. Angela knew she couldn't change everything overnight, but this was the moment to speak up, to act, and she would do it right now. That moment felt like a slow explosion in the air, thick and silent, where every heartbeat of those present could be felt. Angela Freeman stood at the counter of Meridian Financial Bank, a symbol not only of resilience, but of power forged through years of sacrifice. But today, she wasn't standing there as an executive. She stood simply as a customer, a woman treated unjustly, and this injustice, she knew, could not be allowed to persist. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a glow that made her feel as though she were under a microscope. Every gesture and glance magnified. Everything was unfolding too clearly. Beth, the counter employee, hesitated but eventually decided to call for someone in charge. Mark stood there, his eyes brimming with suspicion, as if searching for a way to justify his actions. A discomfort spread through Angela's chest, but she didn't let it show. She stood tall, hands gripping her bag, showing no trace of fear. Now, she was no longer an anonymous customer. She wasn't just the woman in this simple outfit. She was someone who had risen to the top of the banking world, and no one, absolutely no one, had the right to treat her this way. As the wait dragged on, the atmosphere in the bank thickened. Mark and Beth exchanged a glance, then turned back to Angela, but neither spoke. The silence was a challenge in itself. Eyes around her began to focus on her. They didn't know who she was, and that made the situation all the more charged. Angela glanced at the clock on the wall, its relentless ticking showing no sympathy for her wasted moments. Each passing second was another drop, overflowing the cup. Then, the tension seemed to burst as Angela decided to step forward. Her footsteps echoed, firm and authoritative, a sound no one around her could ignore. She walked straight to the counter, where nothing would ever be the same again. With a piercing look at Beth, she spoke plainly. "Can you call someone higher up? I want to speak to the manager of this bank right now." Angela's voice didn't shout or waver. It was a statement that weighed heavily on the room. The silence grew denser. Beth stared at Angela, as if assessing whether she was a legitimate customer or just another ordinary one. Though flustered, Beth turned away, attempting to summon someone to handle the situation. When she returned, her eyes betraying hesitation, Angela knew this was the moment everything would shift. Suddenly, she smiled, not out of satisfaction, but out of resolve. Angela Freeman exhaled, looking at Mark and the surrounding employees awaiting a response. At this point, silence was no longer an option. And then, the undeniable truth came forth. "Can you call Diane Porter, the executive director of this bank?" Angela said, her voice ringing out with strength and certainty. The room fell deathly still, eyes locked on her, no one daring to blink. Mark froze, his lips parting slightly, but no words came out. Those around them began glancing at each other, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief at what they'd just heard. That brief sentence was powerful enough to shake the entire bank. "You're the executive director of this bank?" Beth's mouth dropped open, her eyes wide. She couldn't believe it, couldn't fathom that the woman standing before them, the one they'd doubted and treated unfairly, was the very person they'd heard of, the highest leader of this entire organization. Angela didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at them, her gaze unwavering. She knew there was no salvaging this moment. All their discrimination and attitudes had been laid bare. Angela Freeman wasn't just an ordinary customer. She was the CEO of Meridian Financial, unrecognized by these employees when she walked in. The room was silent for a heartbeat. The world seemed to stop. Now they knew. Angela Freeman was someone their discrimination and disdain couldn't touch, and now they would face the consequences of their actions. "Yes," Angela finally spoke, her voice devoid of any tremor. "I am Angela Freeman, the CEO of this bank, and I will not let this continue." Beth's eyes glazed over for a few seconds, unable to process what she had just heard. She turned to Mark, her gaze filled with confusion and doubt. Everything seemed to freeze in the space around them, and Angela could feel the shift in the air. The tension had reached its peak. Everyone, bank employees, customers, fell silent. No one uttered a word. Angela stood there, unwavering and resolute. She didn't need to explain or justify herself. All she had to do was maintain her steady stance and look them straight in the eye. She knew their gazes would shift, their judgments would turn back on themselves. Beth stammered a few incoherent words. Flustered, she glanced at Mark, unsure of what to do. In that moment, Mark felt a heavy weight settle in his chest, as if he had committed an irreparable mistake. He looked at Angela, and his eyes no longer held the confidence or certainty they once did. All the self-assured authority he'd clung to crumbled into fragile shells on the verge of shattering. You're Angela Freeman?" Mark stuttered, his voice unable to mask his bewilderment. Angela gave a sharp smile. "Yes, I am Angela Freeman, the CEO of this bank." Her voice was strong, without a hint of hesitation, resonating like a proclamation of inevitable change. Richard, standing nearby, couldn't take his eyes off her. Both he and Beth stood frozen, unsure how to react. But there was no denying it. In their eyes now was something that hadn't been there before. Fear. Fear of being exposed. Fear of being caught doing wrong right in front of a woman they had treated with contempt for so long. Richard was the first to break the silence. He shook his head almost as if trying to deny the reality unfolding before him. We didn't know you were. I was just..." He swallowed hard, his voice faltering. "Just what?" Angela looked at him directly. "Just a bank employee whose job is to treat every customer fairly, but today you did something this bank cannot forgive." The tension escalated further. The other employees exchanged glances, their eyes darting from Angela to Jessica Keller, the branch manager, but no one dared speak. Jessica stood silently in a corner, trying to hide the growing anxiety within her, though the beads of sweat on her forehead betrayed her mounting fear. Angela turned to Jessica, her gaze unflinching. "You manage this branch, don't you?" she asked, her voice cold and devoid of emotion. "And yet, you didn't realize you've fostered an environment of discrimination and disrespect? Do you know that the actions of the employees under your supervision violate bank policy?" Jessica mumbled something incoherent, attempting to clarify, but before she could finish, Diane Porter, the executive director, suddenly appeared. Her arrival cut through the moment like a sharp blade. Jessica fell silent, and the other employees said nothing more. They realized the situation had spiraled beyond their control, and now they would face the undeniable consequences of their mistakes. Diane Porter strode in, her steps swift and steady, like a storm approaching. She moved past the petrified employees without a greeting or a glance. Every eye in the room followed her, filled with dread. "What are you all doing here?" Diane's voice rang out, devoid of patience. She looked at Jessica, then turned to Mark, Richard, and finally settled on Beth, her gaze brimming with reproach. Jessica stiffened. "Ma'am, we were just trying to ensure all transactions were legitimate." Diane didn't let her finish. "There's nothing to ensure here. You treated Angela Freeman, the CEO of this bank, like an ordinary customer. What have you done? Why didn't any of you recognize her?" The room fell silent. The other employees lowered their heads, none daring to meet Diane's eyes or face her furious glare. Angela stood still, her expression devoid of emotion, staring directly at the bowed heads of the bank's staff. "So what? What are you going to do?" Mark finally spoke, his tone defensive but unable to hide his unease. Angela smiled coldly. "I'll require all of you to leave, right now." Everything became crystal clear in an instant. Angela's words struck like lightning in the darkness, jolting everyone in the bank awake. It wasn't just a dismissal. It wasn't just a candid reckoning of what had happened. It was the start of an irreversible change. The truth had been laid bare, and no one could escape it. The room was silent, the air so thick it felt suffocating. All eyes were fixed on Diane Porter, the executive director of Meridian Financial. She entered with swift, decisive strides, each step resounding on the marble floor like a warning melody of what was to come. The fearful and ashamed glances of the bank employees darted between one another, but no one dared meet her gaze or offer an excuse. Angela Freeman, the CEO of the bank, stood still at the counter, her expression devoid of emotion. Yet within her, tension surged like a towering wave. She knew this moment would be pivotal, a point where justice would be served. This wasn't just about one person. It was about systemic change, about dismantling the barriers that bank employees unwittingly erected daily through their thoughts and actions. Diane halted in the middle of the bank's lobby, surrounded by employees with bowed heads, none daring to move. She surveyed them, her eyes cold and devoid of patience. Jessica Keller, the branch manager, stood nearby, but as Diane's gaze swept over her, she couldn't hide the rising panic within. Mark, Richard, and Beth fared no better. They stood pale-faced, as if fully aware that their mistakes had been exposed, with no way back. Diane wasted no time. She stood there, calm and composed, but everyone present could feel the authority in her every movement. She didn't need to shout or raise her voice. Everything was already clear, and now it was time for her to act. "Jessica," Diane's voice rang out, echoing through the vast space of the bank. "You're the manager of this branch, aren't you?" Jessica didn't respond immediately, a wave of confusion washing over her. Diane locked eyes with her, not letting a single moment slip by. "You allowed your employees to treat a customer, no, not just any customer, but the CEO of this company, in a way you know is wrong. Do you realize the gravity of this?" Jessica lifted her head, her lips pressed tight. A sudden surge of frustration rose within her, but it was halted the moment Diane's gaze met hers. Diane continued, her voice unwavering, each word carefully measured. "Today, we're not just facing a mistake, but a severe violation of the core values this bank prides itself on. Every promise of fairness, respect, and exceptional service has been trampled by your actions." Jessica's face paled, but she had no words to offer. No justification could excuse what she and her staff had done. Diane turned to Mark, her expression devoid of sympathy. "And you?" she asked, unflinching. "What do you think of what you've done, treating a customer this way alongside Richard and Beth?" Mark stood motionless, but the sweat on his forehead betrayed his fear. Diane didn't wait for an answer. "You realize that your actions weren't just simple disrespect. They undermined one of the most critical values this bank has built, our customers' trust in us." Richard stood, flustered, his face drained of color, and when Diane's gaze fell on him, he could do nothing but lower his head. He didn't dare meet her piercing stare. "This isn't a minor error, nor is it just an issue between you and me," Diane went on, her tone unchanged. "Justice will be served, and it's not just about firing a few people. This is a lesson for all of you, and an opportunity for us to reflect on ourselves, to see if this bank can truly rise above." She looked around, ensuring her words reached every ear. "I won't let this discrimination continue. Jessica Keller, Mark, Richard, and Beth, all of you can leave now, so I don't have to witness you further eroding the core values of this bank." The space fell into a breathless silence, broken only by the faint sound of footsteps as the named employees stepped back, their faces unable to conceal their shame. Angela stood there, saying nothing. She looked at the dismissed employees, her eyes not reflecting satisfaction but regret. She didn't want them to face this, but she also knew that sometimes change required confronting the truth, and today the truth had been laid bare. Diane continued, her voice now filled with resolve. "Effective immediately, I'm ordering a review of all branch operations. Every employee will undergo mandatory training on respect and equality in customer interactions. We're not just a bank, we're part of a community, and we must reflect that in every action we take." She glanced at Angela, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Angela Freeman, for helping us recognize this failure. Today, this bank enters a new chapter where justice, respect, and equality will be inviolable values." The room paused in silence for a moment, but then a gentle wave of relief began to spread. This wasn't an end, but the beginning of a hopeful new chapter. Angela hadn't just triumphed over discrimination. She had opened the door to a fairer future, where every customer, no matter who they were, would be respected. "This isn't over," Diane said, turning back to the remaining employees standing in wait. "And I'll be watching your every step.